provide you with a general outline of what we're going to cover through this presentation. So I'm going to be describing my account of a communicative paradigm that I heard at the United Nations that they were propelling. So within this paradigm, the United Nations identifies its broader discourse community with common goals as those who engage with different scopes of linguistic revitalization initiatives. So these initiatives cover the revitalization strategies themselves, but also the infrastructures around these processes. So these initiatives can involve communication strategies that drive developments for language infrastructures, as well as the accompanying interfaces that enable the transmission of information. So that's going to look like data sets and the accompanying interfaces on the web. So like digital keyboards, the websites themselves, and these technological counterparts. So these initiatives have varying levels of organizational and development, and as such have opportunities to be brought into United Nations events like the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So with that, these can allow for recommendations to potentially be made for the projects themselves to be discussed, as well as networks to strengthen amongst groups who are doing similar things. And as we would discuss through this presentation, there's deliberate speech acts within these permanent forums that the UN identifies as best practices for conveying information to everybody while they're there in practice. These features of communication are going to be most effectively informed through United Nations frameworks. So through these frameworks, they're encouraging participation within their communicative paradigm. And we're going to attempt to describe these paradigms through a theoretical lens that accounts for the time, space, and the construction of personhood. So this theoretical lens is referred to as the chronotope, and further and broader, a chronotopic paradigm. And this theoretical lens the United Nations has established is really pushed through the decade of indigenous languages. So with that, I venture to suggest that we're going to pay attention to their communication strategies that advance the practical assessment of these paradigms. With that, ahead of the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues in April of this year of 2024, there were some key questions to address and how to effectively engage the forum itself, but also networks that are found within the forum. These questions are going to be informed through the 23rd session, the theme for the 23rd session, which is framed around enhancing Indigenous people's rights to self-determination as it connects to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as it connects further to enhancing sustainable youth development. With such a diverse potential for the application of these themes, my focus is on how these communication strategies are pushed forth, but how they are themselves, as a meta-discursive practice, strategized to support my inquiry. So moving from the broad implications of language in information dissemination, let's delve into its critical role in revitalization efforts and systems. Individuals and organizations both interface with data through a variety of methods. Therein, the processes of signification that these data points are configured around follow important contexts to identify the scopes of productivity that may be or may not be present within these endeavors. So building on this understanding, a semiotic analysis of UNDRIP itself can offer compelling avenues for the contextualization of these information points, which are crucial in strategies for Indigenous language revitalization. A semiotic analysis is going to involve a process that looks at the processes of signification, that is, how signs, symbols, and communication are leveraged to have productive levels of information transmission. So what that looks like for UNDRIP can look like algorithms that underlie digital interfaces and the people in specific time and space contexts who actually create these algorithms, and that influences whether these processes of coding are going to be culturally reflective with regard to translations and other data interfaces that people are going to go and have with the internet or other infrastructures like a digital keyboard, for example. For our purposes here, I'm going to discuss an approach to meaning making within these realms with regard to language revitalization, as the activities that promote it itself have to consider adequate paths to get to promoting it. So these levels of importance when evaluating the viability of language revitalization or the ability to work successfully lie in the identification of these paradigmatic structures that support the processes. These paradigmatic elements, not elephants, are going to reflect specific appeals to how contexts are situated or how they're created, and in what manner these contexts are intended to interact with one another. And in this way, I'm looking at the United Nations Decade of Indigenous Languages as a paradigmatic lens itself that's going to seek to advance how linguistic reclamation proceeds. Through this process, the decade itself serves as the temporal frame that highlights these symbolic qualities that can have the potential to foster productivity with respect to the viability of revitalization efforts. So exploring Bakhtin's concept of chronotope, we can apply this framework to understand the interplay as it relates to time and space within these revitalization efforts. In this light, this paradigm can serve as an index or a signpost that's going to highlight what is important to talk about with respect to the developments of coordinated conversations as they're going to relate to these infrastructures that people develop as cross-network structures. It's here that Bakhtin posited that, quote, chronotopes are mutually inclusive. They coexist, they may be interwoven with one another, replace or oppose one another, and with that, they also might contradict each other and find themselves in ever more complex interrelationships, end quote. Here, we will find that time and space are not semiotically isolated and are actually the frames in which these discursive practices become operative. And that's another way to say how different qualifications of value change and influence one another as they flow through the communicational layers of a subject. It's important to consider that these strategies vary depending on the unique circumstances of each community. But nonetheless, establishing a general framework can provide essential guidance for these communities who are striving to preserve critical elements of their cultures. The concept of a chronotopic paradigm, as advocated by the United Nations, underscores pivotal activities that are going to drive these linguistic efforts forward. At the forefront of these initiatives lies a multifaceted initiative driven by the United Nations Permanent Forum. They have consistently advocated for both constitutional and legal recognition of indigenous languages and have put forth robust efforts for this through initiatives that drive networks of preservation, revitalization, and most importantly, to secure adequate funding for these processes. So as the forum calls for these different levels of recognition for indigenous language revitalization, these are the central elements themselves that are filling out this paradigm that they're talking about, incorporating into everybody's general speech to engage with one another. Actions that support the forum's call for constitutional and legal recognition of indigenous languages can also be advanced through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's known as UNDRIP and is a comprehensive statement addressing a range of human rights. So the 46 articles that comprise UNDRIP, they can provide a foundation and a direction for communities to pursue their rights when these policies are incorporated into their respective political networks, or further, if these policies that are written in UNDRIP are reflected directly into a tribe's governing body. And with that, UNDRIP signifies much needed developments in international legal norms and would also reflect the UN's paradigm because it signals communicative strategies that underlie organization. UNDRIP contains various articles addressing language, such as Articles 13, 14, and 16. These articles provide a general frame to channel nuanced community context through, and to that extent, channeling these nuanced community contexts through the frame of UNDRIP would directly reflect the performance of this paradigm, which is what they're asking for, so that way people can understandably and cohesively engage with one another at events like the Permanent Forum, the United Nations Permanent Forum. But however, before the Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues, I found that the United Nations officials were promoting the performance of this paradigm through a bunch of different avenues leading up to the forum. And one of these avenues was found in March of 2024 when I attended a UN training for best practices while at the forum. So this was a digital international collaborative model that we all jumped into a Zoom room to talk about pretty much code of conduct. How are we going to engage each other? How are you going to bring the nuanced challenges of your community to a context of which somebody might not even know what you're talking about? So at that training session, they underscored effective communication strategies that align with their paradigm for specifically Indigenous peoples. The moderators of this training explained what the Permanent Forum is. They regarded it as an advisory council, and a place to make statements that of the ways that UNDRIP itself is implemented in one's community. They said, to be clear with these ideas in mind, one must be strategic. They must be very strategic with their communication at the forum, because like I said, these are people coming from all around the world to talk to others for recommendations about things they might not have an idea about, like geographically, culturally, and even economically in these cases as well. So in alignment with this year's theme, the moderators urged a couple of things. The first one that they urged was they want people to understand what the United Nations as an entity actually is. So the UN acts as a mechanism that can potentially advance a community's initiatives, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to, which completely brings in the point of the strategic communication, because they're only able to help people with the ways that the community clearly articulates the specific mechanisms that they need help with, such as the infrastructures for revitalization processes. Thus, as a pretext to the forum itself, the training moderators expressed the importance of participating in this communicative paradigm that is advanced in part through UNDRIP. So they said for the theme for this year, they want everybody to have an understanding of how UNDRIP is going to reflect directly into your community, and then just to communicate that as such. So one of these key aspects to generate awareness and appropriate paths at the forum this year, like I said, is that performing this paradigm effectively manifests through direct applications of UNDRIP, and more importantly, what that looks like in one's practice, or one's community in practice itself. So a good example here, as a general example, can be noted through a tribe's educational committee whose task is to transmit language, culture, and traditions intergenerationally, as indicated in Article 13 of UNDRIP. And further, a more precise example can be found through digital interfaces created by a community for a community that is exemplified through the Maori's establishment of the Ware Koreo licensure system, for example. This licensure system was created by the community and is a protected data repository and living data licensure system that promotes retention and protections to specifically intellectual property rights. So this data set is a public thing, but it's not just public as in you can pull up some internet page and have access. There's consultation processes, very akin to like NAGPRA 106 stuff, where you would have to go and talk with them as to why you're even trying to access that community's data sets. So furthermore, the moderators also suggested developing awareness around other resources that utilize UNDRIP itself, such as the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. The expert mechanism contains 7 members who are appointed by the Human Rights Council and are also selected on the basis of competence and experience in the rights of Indigenous peoples, with due consideration for experts of Indigenous origin, but most importantly, the gender balance to have both feminine and masculinized energies on these panels. So the expert mechanism identifies key elements that can hinder the realization of the United Nations Declaration in a given community. In their 16th session of the expert mechanism, they maintained that, quote, UNDRIP is not readily accessible to large numbers of Indigenous peoples for a multitude of reasons. These reasons include their wide cultural and linguistic diversity, geographic factors such as remoteness and wide dispersion, socio-political and educational marginalization, as well as limited access to both telecommunications and other informational resources, end quote. Addressing these elements that can hinder UNDRIP's actualization in a community can be found through these clear and effective patterns for communicating these challenges. These patterns themselves may rest upon symbolic interactions that can be informed through a focus on disaggregated data sets. These disaggregated data sets refer to each specific point that the aggregated data set is painting a picture of. Here, these challenges of accessibility may be brought to task by promotions of networks with a framework that supports the integration of these specific aspects of information and resources, these disaggregated data sets. In doing so, these interpretations of agency align with what Dr. Tennant explains, where, quote, the meanings of self-determination must not only be tailored to each country and region of the world, but they must also include the entire range of political arrangements, end quote, so they can provide opportunities for a community to engage UNDRIP in both a culturally representative manner that can also be reflected and expressed through these disaggregated data sets, so they have a more qualitative picture of what's happening on the ground before they start to try to make generalized assertions about anything. Really, they're asking the people and looking at these qualitative disaggregated data sets to get the picture right there. These accumulated points of information can serve to shed lights on specific issues, such as a community's challenges and endeavors with revitalization. From another angle, a paradigm for linguistic initiatives can also readily highlight signals that cue one to pay attention to specific rights, but more importantly, effective ways to express the application of these rights within a community. In line with this, the expert mechanism maintains that, quote, it is necessary to develop specific indicators for the distinct collective rights of Indigenous peoples. For example, rights relating to lands, territories, cultures, languages, and also traditional economic activities. These indicators can be regarded as semiotic features of this paradigm as meaning is produced for intended recipients. In this way, these points of information and their specific indicators fall in line with processes of mutual engagement that are advanced through the layers that undergird this communicative paradigm. Network-forming layers can be found through intersections between the United Nations, international agencies, states, and Indigenous peoples, whereas all those that are involved are all actors in what can be understood as a process of mutual engagement. Part of this process with respect to linguistic initiatives specifically entails establishing a reciprocally agreed upon procedure for these communities to go forth with. This is important as the active construction of this paradigm can be positively influenced by mutual interfaces and signposts that signal broader levels of value for a community while grounding them in individuals' expressions expressed through these disaggregated data sets. It is here that Dr. Leonard points out that, quote, he knows that the field of linguistics, for example, is going to continue to study Indigenous languages, and that therefore he wants to ensure that those interactions and associated interventions will happen in good ways, end quote. Assurance that these interactions and associated conduct happen in good ways can be more soundly developed through more transparent and beneficial mutual engagements that can foster a balance between data production, community engagement, but also how protections on how these data sets are applied within a wider continuum. Conversely, groups that establish negatively generalized perceptions of other peoples and then disseminate these perceptions through their own communicative paradigms must be addressed to promote association for mutually beneficial terms. Here, as Dr. Gray Morning explains, quote, governments in both Canada and the United States have worked to create an inaccurate and myth-like image of the political subjugation they sought to exert over Indigenous North Americans, end quote. In one sense, for linguistic preservation and revitalization to maintain viability, these negatively oriented communicative paradigms that serve to compromise others' infrastructures must be navigated through more developed scopes of dialogue. For example, a lack of data ownership by a community or accessibility to tools created from these communities' linguistic data sets reflect these compromised infrastructures. So for effective measures to be taken, these levels of communication should adhere to common causes, specifically for self-determination, cultural and linguistic retention, and more specifically, they should be channeled through the proper legal forums that may uphold appeals to accountability. As such, in this globally networked world we inhabit, these common threads of dialogue should reflect pursuits in a more ecologically minded fashion that is seeking a common understanding for those integrating into a network with one another. One medium to catalyze shifts in how this linguistic paradigm is advanced can be identified through communication in educational institutions. There are a variety of pathways these environments may take, such as programs within an existing university that operate on a variety of scales, workshops and programs outside of universities that have a broader community reach, but as well as immersion schools with the sole focus on invigorating language. To maintain credibility and the potential for more opportunities to legitimize this paradigm, there are accreditation institutions such as the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium. These accreditation institutions themselves can provide and or validate a variety of standards that can support inquiries to larger institutions by a variety of communities that can help them with both funding streams but also best practices to go forth with. Part of the accreditation process involves an assessment of what plans, methods, and programs are going to be applied and how they're going to go after those processes. This chronotope I'm describing can point to exactly what methods, plans, and programs will drive the processes involved as it operationalizes specific communication features that are going to drive these revitalization strategies forward. There are a variety of linguistic revitalization methods that can be adequately inserted into a program, and they can also take on many different paths to achieve its proper implementation as it is reflected of the unique challenges a community is going to face. So in concert with the UN's Decade of Indigenous Languages, we were talking about at the UN conversational methods that focus on visualization rather than memorization, as they can help to promote the acquisition of language in ways that can advance critical assessments of these processes that are driving them. So it is here that when Dr. Graymorning built a house of language, he's enabling his students to learn more closely aligned as emic learners when working with his method, accelerated second language acquisition. And focusing specifically on these houses of language, individuals and their communities may assess the building materials that are necessary to foster viability within their community. So the chronotope I am attempting to describe may serve as the vehicle to express these nuanced assessments that a community may make with direct regard to the building materials that they deem necessary to promote cultural continuity within their specific circumstances. In this way, accelerated second language acquisition may also be approached in clear and cohesive ways that identify the exact conditions that are needed to promote cultural continuity. These conditions and features themselves are the contributions that the UN is looking for, as these can highlight the specific elements that yield productive results within a community. So for example, when I was at the Permanent Forum, as it wasn't explicitly stated, conceptual approaches to accelerated second language acquisition were upheld by a number of participants at the forum. For example, ASLA accounts for the cultural and psychological layers that inform one's acquisition of a language, such as when the learner of a second language approaches that process with both aspects of logic and problem solving from their first language. Here, in doing so, this method may be leveraged to hasten the learning of a language by addressing these psychological and cultural layers that inform one's structural understanding of a language. Bridging this conceptual approach to United Nations panel, accounting for these nuances is highly important when connecting linguistic initiatives to technology, for example. At the forum, panelists in a revitalization presentation pointed out algorithmic biases that are embedded in digital resources that are reflective of an asymmetrical linguistic marketplace. They indicated that just about half of these digital resources, such as the translators, digital keyboards, and other language interfaces like a website in general, is informed through an English content language and has very little access to disaggregated Indigenous language data sets to use as training data, if any of these data sets are available in the first place. Moreover, these disaggregated data sets may run into compatibility issues due to software conglomerates having a large hold on the market and who can even interface with these technological initiatives. So it is these sorts of challenges that identify key concepts at play within the UN's paradigm, namely a need for community members to have more access, more mobility, and more command over how these resources are established to provide a more accurate, representative, and culturally relevant mode for the maintenance of culture. Thus, they say that through a grassroots or bottom-up approach, these decentralized characteristics of communication can promote a critical analysis of the social, cultural, and political factors that in turn can address specific best practices to drive these processes forward. Here, the disaggregated data can inform these critical analyses by shedding these lights on the layers that we've been mentioning. This chronotope is multifaceted in its organizational arrangement and opens the space for a variety of interpretations that have a variety of interpretations, but also applications within the community.
Kevin, you're about ready to move into the next speaker's time.
No, I was just taking on my question time. So as such,
We're about ready to move into the next person's talk time.
Yeah, so with the United Nations paradigm, they pretty much cited that. As we've been noting through the conversations up to this point, these measures are driven most effectively as we spark dialogue together. So through annual events like this conference, as well as the United Nations Permanent Forum, these are environments to strengthen these new pathways of existing together.
All right.